Hello, and welcome to the Living History series of the American Physiological Society. Today is August 18th, 2009, and we're at the Vanderbilt University School of Medicine in Nashville, Tennessee. We're here to interview Dr. Charles R. Park, better known as Rollo to his many friends and associates. My name is Jim Jefferson, given name Leonard. I am chairman of the Department of Physiology at Penn State University College of Medicine, and I am a past president of the American Physiological Society. With me to do the interview is Dr. Nancy J. Hudson. Nancy is recently retired from her position as Senior Vice President of Pfizer Global Health and Development, and she is also retired from her position as Director of the Groton New London Laboratories. Both Nancy and I were graduate students of Rollo, so it is a particular pleasure for us to have the opportunity to conduct this interview. Dr. Park was born in Baltimore, Maryland. He did his undergraduate work at Harvard, and his medical degree he obtained from Johns Hopkins University. He then did chief residency at Peter Brigham Hospital in Boston. And following 3 years of military service, he went to the Carl and Gertie Corey Laboratory at Washington University in St. Louis. In 1952, Rollo became chair of the Department of Physiology at Vanderbilt University, a position he held for 32 years. During that time, Rollo made many significant contributions to the area of endocrine and metabolic physiology. Perhaps more importantly, however, his sage advice and encouragement, as well as a knack for recognizing and recruiting highly talented individuals, allowed Rollo to build a physiology department into an internationally respected center for research on hormone action, membrane transport, and metabolic regulation. During this interview, you will hear about the early years of Rollo's life, as well as circumstances surrounding the evolution of the Department of Physiology from the way it was when he took over in 1952 to the elite status it enjoys today. Rollo, welcome to the Living History Project, and thank you for agreeing to be interviewed for this series. Let's start by having you share some of your memories about your early life and those influences, parents, friends, books, etc., that contributed to your career development.
Well, Jim and Nancy, it's a privilege for me to see you people again and to be here on this occasion. My life has been characterized by good fortune, which has been brought about by lots of good people, beginning with my parents. My father was a very well-known pediatrician. My mother was a school teacher, but she made her name by establishing nursery schools, first in Baltimore and then in many other places. I was given the very best of education by my parents. Perhaps one of the best years of my life was spent in Germany. I finished high school early and was deemed correctly to be not mature enough to go to college, so my parents sent me to Germany, and I lived with a German family there for a year. It was an extraordinary year. The first 2 years of my life there were the first 2 years of Hitler's life as Chancellor of Germany. And so I saw the conversion of Germany from a very sort of beaten down population to an enormously active, lively population, which characterized the early days of Hitler in Germany. He was immensely successful, as you may remember. Only a little bit later did all of his sins appear, and trouble, and so forth. I was a poor student at Harvard, but in those days it didn't much matter as far as getting into medical school. I remember going for an interview in the interview, a very well-known radiologist at the Peter Van Brigme asked me, "Is your father Dr. Edwards Park?" And I said, "Yes." "Oh," he said, "you'll get into medical school." And that was the way life was in those days. And after medical school, I went to the Corey Laboratory, an extraordinary place, and I could say a great deal about it, but I'll say that my companions there, 4 of them in later years, each one of them got a Nobel Prize. So they were a unusual bunch. And of course, one of them was Earl Sutherland. Earl and I became very good friends, and that was very instrumental in persuading Earl to come to Vanderbilt, where he made an extraordinarily important contribution to the department and to the school here.
Besides Dr. Sutherland, there were others from the Corey Lab that ended up at Vanderbilt as well, correct?
Yes, indeed. Several of them, including my wife, Jane Park. She was a graduate student there. I could say a lot about her. Good things, no bad things.
Better not.
But anyway, when the time came for me to leave the Corey Laboratory after 5 years, approximately 5 years there, I had received notice from Vanderbilt that they were looking for a new chairman. And I should say, in all honesty, that Vanderbilt at that moment was in desperate straits. They had invited 4 very distinguished and competent physiologists to accept the chair there and had been turned down. The reason Vanderbilt had been turned down was that the offer that Vanderbilt made was really miserable. But I was in a state as a graduate, as a postdoctoral fellow, where to suddenly become chairman of a department and full professor was pretty attractive. And then I had offered an enormous salary of $10,000 a year from Vanderbilt, which was a huge jump. However, those were good things. The bad things were rather apparent also. The department was in a terrible state. There were just 2 professionals active there. One was Robert Post, who went on to become a very distinguished physiologist, and Ray Mung, M-E-N-G, who also had a very distinguished career, but they were 2 just starting physiologists at that time, and I was just starting as a physiologist at that time. I must say that, well, before I go on to that, I'd just say that the physical attributes of the department would be unbelievable in present terms. We had the total sum of 5,000 square feet for the department. Half of it was turned over all year long for the medical students, where they did their physiology experiments. And what remained was essentially without any equipment, much beyond just some benches. But we started in there, and I had a tremendous amount of help from my wife. We had just gotten married, but almost immediately after our honeymoon, she went off to New York to work with a very distinguished biochemist, Severo Ochoa, and he also was a Nobel winner some years later. And I don't know why, well, I do know why, but Janie, after spending a year with him, came down and then began to work at Vanderbilt, where she made a tremendous contribution, beginning with a theft. We had no glassware in the department to do any biochemical work, but she stole some from the Ochoa laboratory and sent them to me, and that helped to get us started. So my life started with a theft. But other people came down very quickly. We got a wonderful postdoctoral fellow from Germany. His name was Dankwart Reinwein. He went on to be a very distinguished endocrinologist in Germany. We had a couple of people, 3 people at least, came down in the first few months of our stay at Vanderbilt from the Corey Laboratory, secretary and laboratory assistant and graduate student. Murray Heimberg was a very early, I don't know if you, Murray Heimberg went on to have a very good career, still active in as head of pharmacology, University of Memphis, University of Tennessee in Memphis. We had no money. We had no equipment except a few pipettes and a little bit of glassware. I did have a research idea to work on, which is very important. Near the end of my stay at the Corey Laboratory, I worked on a problem. I will just mention, I think it is interesting. The Coreys earlier had proposed, turned out to be incorrect, that the action of insulin was due to the activation of hexokinase, which is the enzyme which is responsible for the disappearance of glucose in tissues. That activation of hexokinase, utilization of glucose, would account for how insulin lowered the blood glucose level. That had become under some question at least by Carl Corey. And I remember my first fairly early experiments in the Corey laboratory were to try to confirm that observation, which we could not do. Turned out to be a fabrication of an earlier person working in the Corey laboratory. But anyway, as I left Corey laboratory, another man, Joe Bornstein, who later became professor of biochemistry in Australia, he and I devised some what we call late-night experiments you do after your regular day is finished. Very important things to do. And we decided that we could demonstrate that in simple experiments that insulin activated the penetration of glucose into the tissue, but not the hexokinase. And we did those experiments at Corey Laboratory. We took the results to the Coreys, and they looked at them. I can still remember when a couple of days later they called us into the office and said, Rollo, he's a strong German accent, Rollo, we have looked at your experiments and we do not believe them. So we didn't do any more up there, but we carried these experiments to Nashville. And
what was the tissue preparation that those?
The tissue preparation was the rat diaphragm.
Okay.
And you incubated the rat diaphragm in a glucose solution with or without insulin. If insulin, then after a short incubation, you took out the diaphragm, you analyzed it for its glucose content. And if the content went up, that indicated that glucose had penetrated into the tissue went up more with insulin there, so insulin promoted the penetration. On the other hand, if insulin had activated the hexokinase, the content of glucose would have gone down because, and these experiments showed clearly that the content went up.
Did they tell you why? Did the Coreys tell you why that they didn't believe these data?
Well, you see, they still were under the hope, I think, that their old experiments with showing activation of hexokinase would turn out, despite everything, to be correct. And it took it years, that idea, to die. Literally decades. People still sort of hung on to it. It was a very nice idea, but just didn't happen to be right. Well, those experiments gave me something to report at the meeting of the American Clinical Young Turks, so-called. And it was, my presentation was a great success, and it led to our getting money and a little bit of recognition, a big step ahead. And then after that, the department began to attract fellows. I mean, there was one very questionable person who came there, came in a big Cadillac, a young graduate student driving a big Cadillac. It was
you never forget, do you?
Never forget. That was Jim Jefferson. He's lived with this for 30 or 40 years.
Was Dave Regan the earliest graduate student in the department?
No. Well, he may have been. He was. Dave Regan actually was a medical student when he came to us.
Okay.
And then he gave up medicine and did become a graduate student. And he got his PhD. And he turned out, of course, also to be an excellent person in every respect, good in science, and a person with a lot of interesting personality. I won't say quirks, but he was not just an ordinary person. Very fond of music. And as later on in life, he devoted all his spare time to music, giving concerts and things, country music, which he was very skillful at. I don't remember exactly the order in which students appeared. You were one of the early ones, Jim.
Yes, I was. I came in 61.
61, yeah.
By that time, I think Dr. Morgan, Howard Morgan, would have joined the department about 5 years after you came here?
Yes.
Something like that.
Howard Morgan, of course, was an absolute star. When I first knew him at Vanderbilt, Howard was an obstetrician. He had graduated in wartime from Hopkins when he became an MD at age 21, which was young even in those days. He became an obstetrician, but he was attracted by research, and he left obstetrics to come and work in the physiology department. And he and I worked together for probably 8 or 10 years. And that was a great experience for me. We did work which attracted a fair amount of attention, work on how glucose and insulin got into muscle tissue, and
well, those experiments really solidified your very first experiment
yes,
with the
absolutely,
rat
yeah,
diaphragm.
yeah. And that they demonstrated, which was not recognized at that time, that that glucose didn't just diffuse into tissues, but there was a specific biochemical mechanism, transport mechanism, which brought it in. Howard and I did a good deal of work demonstrating the kinetics of this process, and we never got around to trying to isolate the transporter. That was done many, many years later by other people. But
what do you think was the greatest synergy between you and Howard that led to that significant work? How did you work together to make it happen?
Well, we worked very closely together. I think we each shared in every aspect of from killing the rats to doing the glucose analyses at the end of these. These were very primitive days, and as you don't know, but they were. You take my word for it. Howard was, as you all know, a tremendous worker, and he inspired me to get out of my native laziness and get into it, which I did. He was good at everything, writing things up and the whole works.
My impression is he had a real knack for the technical side of things, and he and Bailey Moore really contributed in terms of
yes.
setting up equipment that could do the experiments.
Yeah. To do these experiments which were first done with rat diaphragm were criticized because people couldn't distinguish easily whether glucose was going in through the broken membrane around the tissue or through the cells of that tissue. And so for that reason, Morgan and I shifted over to work with a perfused heart, and that then became a major part of my work and a major part of Morgan's work, because after he left and went to Hershey, he kept working with the perfused rat heart for years, and much of his subsequent work was done with that tissue. And I suppose, Jim, you probably got exposed to that too. But
I certainly did, and the work ethic, yes.
Yeah, and the work ethic, yeah. Well, you were pretty good in the work ethic side. Well, then the department grew with people coming into it. I would emphasize very strongly the effect of Janie, my wife, who was attracted a lot of people and attracted a lot of attention. She worked on enzymology in the beginning, studying the mechanism by which glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase, how that enzyme led to the generation of ATP. That was a mysterious subject at that moment, at that time, was for many years afterwards. But that enzyme, as you may remember, takes inorganic phosphate and generates high-energy phosphate from inorganic phosphate. And that was looked on in the early days as probably the mechanism for high-energy phosphate formation. Of course, it turned out to be just a minor contributor in the long run, but her work in that generated a lot of attention. She was a brilliant presenter, attracted a great deal of attention just by presenting these subjects in meetings. And as a result of her work, she went on to work with Ochoa, with Fritz Lippmann, with Britton Chance, all really top-level people. And through them, Vanderbilt got in connection with these various people. And it was a great help to the development of the department.
Could we go back and
Yeah.
have you fill in a little more detail about recruiting Earl Sutherland to the department?
Yes, indeed. Well, the recruitment started in Washington University, where Earl and I became close friends working in neighboring laboratories, but doing our most important contact on the rivers of Missouri, fishing for bass and anything else which would bite. Earl turned out to be a passionate fisherman, and he and I went on many trips. And he had an interesting philosophy in life, plan in life, that he would not spend more than 10 years in any one place, and he stuck with that. He spent, I guess, 10 years in St. Louis, then certainly 10 years in Cleveland, and then he came to Vanderbilt for 10 years, and then ended up in Florida, where he didn't live out his 10 years, unfortunately. But he came to Vanderbilt, I think, because he didn't like being a department chairman, which he was at Cleveland. He was attracted by the fishing opportunities in Nashville, which are very important, and he was, I think, attracted to the people in the department here. He gave up an awful lot when he left Cleveland, laboratory space and people, but very quickly he attracted others to come to join him at Vanderbilt. Bill Butcher and I would guess probably half a dozen people went on to have important careers.
Jim mentioned that one of the strengths that you brought to Vanderbilt was your ability to recruit talent and mentor talent. What did you look for in people as you recruited them, and how do you think you contributed and mentored them in their progression in their career?
Well, you're asking very embarrassing questions.
That's the point.
I don't recall that I did much of any recruiting. I more or less hoped that students would turn up, and it was a very different era. Students now flock to departments and people in large numbers. That was not the case. For instance, the Corey Laboratory, which was a world-famous laboratory, it rarely had more than 2 students at any one time. And in my 5 years there, I don't suppose there were more than 4 or 5 students who came to the department. And that situation was, of course, in my mind, and that's the way it was at Vanderbilt. Students came because they came, not because we went out after them. I mean, some poor unfortunates like you and Jim over there didn't know any better and ended up at Vanderbilt in our department, and of course then made the department in later years known for your having been there.
So Rollo, if you were looking for students today, what qualities would you look for in order to ensure their success, a successful scientist?
Well, I think, of course you want to have general superior intelligence, but inquisitiveness. And I was always impressed. Well, I don't know quite how to put it, but people who, took their work, took their interests home with them, and didn't just didn't regard their work just as work, but really as something which they enjoyed doing, which they got pleasure out of, which made them think about what they were doing when they got home. Very important. And that was conditioned in part by both the experience of myself and of my wife Janie, because what made our experience as graduate students or postdocs successful was work which we were not assigned to do, but work which we ourselves invented. I've described this little work we did with the diaphragm and insulin, and Janie on her late night off-the-record work worked on mechanisms of high-energy phosphate generation by glyceraldehyde phosphate. That made her well-known. Mm-hmm. There was our extracurricular activity which was helpful, mm-hmm. extraordinarily helpful to our careers. And that idea stuck with me. Extracurricular mm-hmm. activity should be encouraged with right. students, and they should want to come back and do a few extra things that just happen to interest them.
It sounds like you're talking about passion or a vocation for science that leads to a dedication.
Yeah, to all those things, yeah. That'd be a more formal way of right. putting it. But
right. How did you encourage these young people that showed up at your door? Because you didn't really recruit them, you're saying. How did you facilitate their success?
Well, the most important thing was probably putting them in the laboratory, encouraging the go ahead. I mean, you could answer these things probably better than I could. Mm-hmm. But I don't know what Jim would say about that, but were you encouraged, or were you just naturally led to it?
I think it was the whole setting that provided the encouragement. Yeah. It was your own mentorship and guidance, but you had lots of good people around that fostered the same type of environment. One of my memories is you taking us over to divinity school for lunch so that you could keep pace, keep track of what we were all doing. So,
I think the way you encouraged us was to always be curious about what we were doing and optimistic that it would lead to something, even though often it felt like it was going nowhere. Yeah. You would say things like, "I'm sure you will figure it out," or "You'll find a way to make this work." So I think it was a general encouragement and optimism, and I guess I would add optimism to the list of traits that you may have looked for in people that were willing to continue to go back and come at the problem again.
I think one thing that did contribute was that we had, I think, very interesting seminars in the early days. Mm-hmm. So that was something a little bit new at Vanderbilt at that time, and we encouraged people in other preclinical departments to come to our seminar and to present stuff there. And we probably had 30 or 40 people who would show in these seminars. And they were, I think, very helpful in stirring up interest. I don't know what you people felt about there at that time.
Right. I would say one of the things, whether it was with outside speakers outside of the department, but within the department, and it's more difficult today, I think, because of the competitive nature of funding, but there was a real openness that you encouraged at lunch every day for people to discuss their work and ask questions of others. So there was a lot of interaction and openness, which I think led to a cross-fertilization and a model of how science should be done.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Yeah.
You generated that feeling.
Well, I don't know about that, but anyway, I certainly
I think you did.
I hope it's true.
It's true.
Well, I think the other thing that made a difference was you had so many connections. We mentioned Philip Randall. I think your early involvement with the Howard Hughes Institute made a difference. In my own experience, Asher Corner was another Englishman that came here And so when I got ready for a postdoctoral experience, you not only encouraged me to experience a culture outside this country, but to go to Dr. Corner's lab. And so you really had a lot of influence in people's choosing, and part of it was the people you knew and who respected you and your opinion about individuals.
Well, that's I'm glad you mentioned that. We did have a lot of, shall we say, important people who came and visited the department, many of them, which was, I'm sure, very helpful. I do want to say one of the things which, despite everything, we survived in the department, and that was the exodus of Howard Morgan, taking with him Jim Jefferson, several other,
Bob Neely,
and
Warren Davis, who
yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's right. And that was, of course, I remember thinking, this is a blow we're going to have a hard time recovering from, but nevertheless we did perceive.
Well, that group, in addition to Glenn Mortimer, who was recruited from NIH, formed the core department that started the new medical school at Penn State.
And then we had, I thought, a continuing very nice relationship with Penn State. And they were responsible for educating my son, who's now a professor of pharmacology. Has very nice memories of that.
I mentioned Howard Hughes' connection.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your memories of the early days of that?
Yes, I can, yeah. Howard Hughes, as everybody knows, was an extraordinary and a bizarre person, full of peculiarities. Very interesting. I speak as if I knew him. I never did meet him. But at a fairly early age, he got interested in aviation, had his own airplane. Of course, he had tons of money. But he got in a very bad wreck, very nearly died, and he attributed to his physician, a man named Mason, Howard Mason, I think his name. Mason was his name. He regarded Mason as having saved his life. And Mason then persuaded Howard Hughes to give some of his money to establishing a institute, medical institute. And gossip, and may be true, is that Howard Hughes had zero interest in medical institute, but he recognized that he could put some of his money in that institute and it would be exempt from the tax, U.S. tax, which was one of his greatest enemies in life. He was always fighting the U.S. taxation system with, I think, some reason. So Howard Mason then collected my former chief at the Brigham, George Thorne, my next chief at the Vanderbilt, Hugh Morgan, and a dean from Schenectady, his name slips me, to form a little committee. And they started then this Howard Hughes Institute, so-called. We had, and Howard Morgan and Thorne were, of course, instrumental in getting me to join this group as a counselor. I might say at the present time, I think I am the oldest living person connected with the Howard Hughes. And as you know, Howard Hughes from this institute, from this very modest beginning, grew to be a gigantic enterprise and a tremendously helpful enterprise in development of medical science in this country. second only to the NIH itself. But anyway, the early days of the Howard Hughes, we five, together with Howard Hughes' secretary, sorry, her name slips me at the moment, but she was a somewhat domineering sort of person. She wanted to run everything, and she thought being Howard Hughes' secretary gave her sort of a special, and it did, position where she could tell people just what to do, and she would report to us what Howard Hughes thought about various things. I don't think he ever thought anything about the Medical Institute. His mind was on other things entirely. Mm-hmm. Of the people in this early institute, only one, Thorne, he was the only one who ever actually met Hughes in person.
Is that right?
It's astonishing to think about, but it all illustrates that, as far as Hughes was concerned, this institute was essentially nothing at all, nothing in his life.
A tax shelter.
Tax shelter. And he put so little money in it, it wasn't much of a tax shelter. But when Hughes died, of course he died intestate, and after a long legal wrangling, his fortune, a big fortune, was turned over to the Hughes. I think it was $5 billion, which in those days, billion meant a lot more than it does today, but that started the ball rolling. But the Hughes in the early days was extraordinarily helpful to Vanderbilt Physiology Department, because we were able to support a number of people on Hughes money. I hesitate to name them. I don't know, Jim, were you a Hughes benefactor? But
Jackie
and
John.
So
John was a long-standing.
And Exton.
Right.
And Howard.
Howard, so many of our best people were supported by Hughes, and we had so little money from Vanderbilt that was very critical in our development, departmental development. Well, I won't say more about Hughes, except it is, I've sort of maintained a distant connection with it over the years. It's just extraordinary to see how from such a small beginning it grew to be such a magnificent and huge enterprise.
So, Rollo, looking back, is there anything you would do differently in your career? That, and I don't mean a major regret, but is there anything you would do differently if you think about it?
Well, I would say, Nancy, that I recognize that fortune was my companion all through life. I had one good thing after another happen to me. And, I mean, fortune like you and Jim coming to the department, and many other people, coming to the department, and the connection with the Hughes, they all came to me out of good fortune. And it began, I guess, really with being born of the parents I was born of. That was a remarkable piece of good fortune. They steered me in ways that was very important to my academic development and contact with people and so forth. And
only the good get lucky, Rollo.
Well, everybody has luck.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
how you deal with it and what you make of it. It sounds to me then that you're saying you have no regrets, that you are very grateful.
I am very grateful.
Yeah.
No, I would wish that I had been somewhat different in my own character, because people who know me well and the people who don't know me so well recognize that there is a a big lazy streak in me. I don't like doing work unless it's fun. I really abhor.
I get it.
Abhor it. Don't do it. As a matter of fact, you know. And
one of the things we haven't talked about is your avocations. I mean, we mentioned fishing, but I think there were other things outside of work that you were interested in as well.
Well, I was always very interested in music. And I had a lifelong career of failures in music. I worked at the piano year after year with good lessons and everything. Came to nothing. I worked at the violin briefly. Came to even less. Then in late life I took up playing the recorder. And with David Region, we had quite a business going. We gave little recorder concerts in many churches in Nashville. And it was the time when a recorder was sort of a novelty. And we got together, some people together, and made little group concerts.
So you did find success.
Well, yes, sort of. As long as you didn't hear the music, you could say so. But the music was pretty pitiful, but interesting.
You used to run a lot back when before running was so
in
vogue.
Could say I was a pioneer in running, and I ran in many races. I was never a good runner, but there were so few people in my age group running that I frequently came in second. I think even I came in first occasionally in races. We ran usually 6-mile races. That was my specialty.
I remember saying to you, Rollo, that I thought running was boring, and you said, you looked at me with a very deadpan look, and you said, you must have thoughts. So, again, that was good guidance for me, what I've never forgotten, that one needs to take time to reflect. And
I seem to remember you had an interest in whitewater rafting as well, and there were some episodes of practicing that. And
David Reason was a participant in some of that, yeah. Well, I should like to say that people like you, Nancy, and Jim especially, and certain other students, you've mentioned David Region, and one of my favorite students has been Jackie Corbin. You all know Jackie Corbin has had, I think, a remarkable career. He's a very, he doesn't put himself forward, but he has made, I think, a really major advance. And that is, he's responsible for the development of Viagra and Cialis, both of these things. Now, Nancy, that, of course, is not in your field exactly. Jim probably never felt any need for those things, but there are thousands, if not millions, of people who are very grateful for that invention, and it was based on extremely good biochemistry, sponsored principally by Jackie Corbin, also by his collaborator
Sharon Francis.
Sharon Francis, another student of which I think the physiology department could be very proud. She started out life in working with Janie as a postdoc, and then shifted over to work with Jackie Corbin. And her work with Jackie Corbin has been a major contribution in my books. And then, of course, one of the most important graduates has been that man who's sitting on your right there, who responsible for setting up at Hershey a really first-class department. I would say really first-class, and has done it while doing himself first-class work, becoming a major figure in the world of protein, protein
Synthesis, metabolism.
Metabolism, yeah, I say.
I recognize that.
Yeah.
Rollo, if you could set aside your normal reticence in talking about yourself or bragging, could you tell us what you think your most important legacy is?
Yeah. Well, that's nice. I enjoy that. But as far as science is concerned, I could sort of name a few which I would regard as accomplishments. And the first might surprise you. What I think was really one of the best works which I did received almost no recognition or attention was a study of how the human body regulates its temperature in relation to the environment. Oh. This was work done at Fort Knox when I was a Army officer there. We had a very good laboratory for studying heat and its effect on human beings. And that was a good piece of work. And then at Vanderbilt, I think the work which blossomed with Howard Morgan on the description of the transport of glucose into muscle tissue and effect of insulin and other hormones on that process. And that was, of course, I think contributed something to our understanding of diabetes in general. What is it that some of the factors, at least, which promote insulin resistance, role of other pituitary hormones, that sort of thing. I think all of that made a contribution to the understanding of diabetes in relationship to the metabolism of glucose. It hasn't contributed really much to the understanding of treatment of diabetes or anything like that directly. Then with John Exton, I think we made a substantial contribution in the role of the liver as a organ producing glucose and the effect of various substrates and hormones on that process. And that, I think, sort of formed a background of importance for the work of Alan Charrington, which sort of took a good deal of that work and improved it by carrying out studies in the whole animal, whereas we had just studied isolated tissue. And then the last thing in my scientific life, I think, was maybe some importance. That was work that I did with a boomrad. And I think we were the first, or certainly among the first, to indicate that there's a transport system for fatty acids in cells, and that boomrad's work is blossoming into I think, quite an important aspect of metabolism. So I think that's about it. A few little odds and ends here and there, but not anything very great in my opinion. But
what about the legacy of the department? What are you proud about this department?
Well, I'm proud of the people who came from the department. I mean, like you and Jim, and then a lot of other people too, Exton, and they all grew up in the department. Janie, quite a lot of first-class people. They're going on, and you have to develop departments or groups elsewhere, which have been very good. It's nice to see that growth.
Mm-hmm. Sounds to me you planted a lot of seeds, both scientifically and with the people that do the science.
Yeah. I should say that I've retired officially, thinking about, I always forget the date, but the end of the 80s.
84.
84, yeah. But then I continued to keep a pretty close eye on the progress of the science that I was interested in. I came to work in the office, which Vanderbilt very generously provided me with almost every day, and didn't work with any, intensity, but I kept alive.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had this automobile. I was involved in this automobile accident just a little bit about a year ago, which was very damaging to my mental state and physical state.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't really maintained scientific contact of any closeness since that, but I have become intensely interested in more philosophical things, which I mentioned. I spend a lot of time, thinking about what is it that we human beings, what's keeping us going, and what's our relationship to religion and to all this sort of thing. Very interesting to me, and I'm at present time trying to write that up a little bit, because I think, and probably very naive, but I think I am going to make a contribution in that area.
It's very interesting.
Yeah. I would just say that probably several years ago, I talked to my brother-in-law, who was a retired Baptist minister, and we got to talking about things. I got to know him very well, good friend, so I didn't mind asking him, well, do you believe that God exists? He said, well, no, I don't. But then he said, I think I'm driven by some sort of force. I said, oh, that's nonsense. And I thought about it, and then I came to the conclusion, yes, we're all driven by an extremely powerful force. Are you driven by a force? You know what it is? No, you know what it is? Do you have a force?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Yeah. Well, the force that I have detected is simply the force for survival, the drive to survive as a person and as a species. And if you don't have that, you're not going to survive. I mean, that is essential.
Mm-hmm.
And that is essential for every living creature, vegetable and animal. That's what we do. We survive. We don't have any, in my view, noble things that we are working on. I mean, a lot of people are impressed that there's some God or that sort of thing that's guiding them, or but I don't believe in any of that. I totally disregard what I would call the formal aspects of religion. I think religion itself is an outcome of this survival drive.
Very interesting.
Totally agree.
I
totally agree. I want to talk about it some more on tonight.
Yeah. So that's what I spend most of my time doing now. I'm trying to write it up in a sensible way.
Wonderful. Is there any other question you want us to ask before, anything else you want to say before we stop?
Well, of course, beginning this afternoon and particularly tomorrow, I'll have 100 questions, which I'd like to talk about, but I think I'm running down now.
Okay. Excellent.
Well, again, Rollo, thank you for participating in this interview. We really enjoyed learning all these aspects about your career, and I'm sure it's going to be of interest to many people who will be looking at this. Thank you.
Thank you, Rollo.
Jim and Nancy, it's been a real pleasure for me. First, to have you two here, and then a pleasure actually to sort of try to review these things in my mind.